Mhm. Hi, everyone. Good evening. How are you all doing? I am Kioma, and I am, for the very first time, I'm here on 721 News. Mikio has lent me his chair for this evening. And as you all know, I know so many of you are tuning in or will be tuning in very soon. And as you all know, there's an insane volcano right now in our sister island, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And this volcano is causing so much concern and continues to cause so much concern as well. So all of us have questions, irrespective of where we are in the region or where we are in the world. We do have concerns because we do have friends and families in St. Vincent as well as out in St. Vincent. And as Caribbean people, Caribbean nation, Caribbean family, we do have concerns for ourselves as well, given the fact that we are all along an archipelago, right? So without further ado, I will definitely, first of all, before we introduce our guest, our special guest, definitely would like to extend heartfelt grace, heartfelt strength, courage to the people in St. Vincent, those who are on the island as well, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as well as outside. We all do have that. I have a friend, she and her family are from St. Vincent, and they're in the US, they're in St. Martin, and there are so many others just like us, all right? So before I continue, let's just dive right in. The way how we work is we also pay attention to our viewers. Currently, we have 196 persons who are tuning live. And let me see. Yes, we have 196 persons, currently 200 who are live. So thank you so much to our viewers for tuning in. Thank you very much for your questions that we received beforehand. Thank you for being here. Without further ado, let's introduce our special guest, no other than Professor Richard Roberts, forgive me. Professor?
Yes, I'm here. I'm glad to be here. And don't worry with the name. I've been mixed up with Richardson, Robertson, Robertson, and all kinds of things. Don't worry about that.
Thank you. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive straight into the questions? Because there are several questions we definitely need to ask you this evening.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm a geologist. I'm based at the Seismic Research Center. I'm actually a national of St. Vincent and Grenadines. I'm a Vincentian, just happens to be a Vincentian too, and the volcano that's erupting is on St. Vincent. But I'm a geologist. I spent a lot of time looking at volcanoes and volcanism, so I know a lot about volcanoes. And I'm here leading the team of scientists who are monitoring the ongoing eruption of Soufriere in St. Vincent.
Thank you so much. So let's dive in. Before we can I just highlight some of our viewers? We have here M. Hook Van Putten, Arlington Daly is here, Karma Gerard is here as well, Elizabeth Augustus Denton is here. So thank you so much for our viewers for tuning in. So our very first question, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a realistic threat? This is from our viewers. Is there a realistic threat of tsunami? If yes, is there a system in place to warn the islands in a timely fashion?
Yes. So no, there's not a realistic threat of tsunamis, except to say that the mechanism that generates tsunamis, one of the ways in which tsunamis are generated in the region or could be generated in the region, is from volcanic eruptions. And usually there are two kind of volcanic eruptions, either those that happen under the sea, so submarine eruptions, or what we call subaerial, of eruptions of volcanoes on the land. And how they generate tsunamis, and this is why on this case we don't think it's likely, is that the ones on land, how they generate tsunamis is by causing, when a large part of the landmass falls into the sea. So you have to have what they call large-scale gravitational collapse of the volcano in order for the tsunami to be generated. And in the context of what we have now at Soufriere, we don't think it's likely for you to have large-scale collapse of the edifice, and therefore being able to generate a tsunami is not likely given the current scenario now the eruption is playing out. But that said, just so for the purpose of your listeners, there is a mechanism in the region for responding to the generation of tsunamis of any kinds, both those generated by volcanoes as well as tectonic sources. And the Caribbean tsunami warning mechanism will kick in if there was a tsunami generated both at a volcano as well as from tectonic sources. And I would expect if there was a possibility this time, it will apply.
That's very good for us to know. I think that brings a sense of ease as well for us to have that level of understanding. So to our viewers who had concern on that, your question was just answered. Our second question is if there is a tsunami, is St. Martin safe from the majority if its effects as the other islands take the brunt of the blow? Like how we see now we're located in St. Martin.
Right. So I mean, given that I've just said that is unlikely, it probably is more necessary to speak about things that are more likely than tsunamis. But in the context of tsunamis, and if it's generated by a volcanic source, and this is so general knowledge, is that volcanic generated tsunamis are not very powerful. Their energy is rapidly used up or dissipated, as we'll say scientifically. So from the source of the point where it generated it, if it's a submarine volcano or if it's a subaerial volcano, it doesn't go very far, generally speaking. So bear in mind that I said it's unlikely that Soufriere will generate a tsunami, right? First of all, right? But if it was not unlikely, let's say if it was not so unlikely, St. Martin is quite a far way away. So I would think that there's a number of, it will have to be really, really big for it to get to the stage where it will cause serious harm as far as where you are. If it was because you're coming from all the way in the southern Caribbean. So I think even if there was a chance that the risk to you from a tsunami generated by a collapse of the edifice in Soufriere would in any case be probably not as high as in some other areas. So first of all, it's not likely. Secondly,
it's not likely.
Yeah. Secondly, even if it had happened, you're pretty far away. So I think it sort of puts you in a little bit more comfortable position than say islands that might have been closer if there was a possibility.
Okay. Very well explained, sir. Thank you. How close can life forms get to freshly molten lava and not be harmed?
Not very close. Fresh magma, in fact, the temperature, as just to understand, at La Soufriere, the eruption started as what's called an effusive eruption, where magma, or molten material, or I like to call it liquid rock, was coming through and coming onto the surface. And when it came onto the surface, it erupted. It formed a dome. And we were able to measure the temperature of the dome, which is the molten, not the molten lava, but a little bit cooler version of it. And we got temperatures up to 600 degrees Celsius at the hottest spots. The molten lava this person is speaking about is even hotter than this. So to answer your question, in fact, I suspect they can answer the question themselves. If they think of any life form, there are very few life forms that will survive in these very hot temperature conditions. There are life forms that do, like in the mid-Atlantic ridge, which is an area where you have a break of the Earth's crust and there's a fissure there and there's very hot temperatures. They do have creatures that like high temperatures, but nowhere near as much as 600 degrees. I suspect most organisms will die, simply die. So you can't get very close to it. And I suspect that anything that is living in the crater would have been having a hard time to survive in the presence of the hot rock that was there for the last 3 months or so.
I must say the questions I'm asking, most of them are from our viewers, from persons who came across our broadcast. So we are an engaging platform. So we really always want our viewers to feel a part of the conversation, and their concerns are being met as well. Yeah. So the questions I'm reading are from our viewers. I saw someone just make reference to a question from Kikem Jenny, and I actually have that listed here as well. So I will just go down to my list to make sure that we stay in track. So I don't want to hopscotch. what are the effects of the environment in terms of global warming throughout the region? How is global warming affected based on the volcanic activities right now?
Well, it's known that one of the ways in which volcanoes affect the environment is by the production of tremendous amounts of ash. If you put a lot of ash into the atmosphere, it affects the thermal effect of the sun, and it cuts out sunlight from certain areas. It puts particles in the atmosphere, fine dust particles that could provide the nucleus for cloud formation. So it has environmental impact, volcanic eruptions, because of the production of ash. They have impact on the environment. There was a volcanic eruption in the Pacific a long time ago, which caused it was such a big eruption. It produced enough ash that circled the globe several times, and it caused winters in Europe around that time to be particularly harsh. So things like that can happen. So in that context, generally volcanic eruptions can have impact on environmental conditions. Global impacts, really, and large-scale impacts will depend on the size of the eruption, the scale of the eruption. So if you have really big eruptions, they have big effects. But small eruptions the effects tend to be more confined. So in that context, the eruption that's happening in St. Vincent is likely to have impact on the environment in St. Vincent itself, and less so on the environment further afield outside of St. Vincent. So as I speak, one of the effects that the ongoing eruption had up to this point, it's had more since, is when the dome was growing, it was producing a lot of volcanic ash, a lot of volcanic gases. And the volcanic gases were quite acidic, and they were having some negative impact on the vegetation that was downwind of the volcano. So there was burning of the vegetation that was going on. Essentially, the discoloration of the leaves. The leaves in some parts of the volcano in the southwest went from green to brown, which meant that they were dying off. And that's an impact in the environment. The volcano has now gone into an explosive phase where it's producing a lot of explosions at its summit, and it's producing a lot of ash. And we'd expect that the environment up at the summit would have some significant impact, because the trees will be destroyed. There will be a lot of damage to vegetation, and the ash itself would now provide condensation nuclei for cloud formation. It also would provide particles in the atmosphere. One of the things that we see from the ash now is a lot of the plumes now is lightning strikes. The ash is gonna go further afield and damage crops. We anticipate that the fine ash would actually get further afield. It gets caught up in the higher level atmosphere, and it goes really far throughout the region. And depending on where it goes, it would have some impact in the environment. Probably not as wide as, say, bigger explosions, but certainly the impact on the environment would be slightly wider than St. Vincent. Mainly St. Vincent, but lesser so to surrounding islands in the Caribbean. Not so much so globally, because the eruption is small, relatively.
This is just me just saying wildly. It's just such a pity, because right now we're in the height of the pandemic still. We're still all globally facing the pandemic. And here it is now, St. Vincent being an island that is focused on vegetation, on agriculture. And now in the midst of the pandemic, something like this happens that also contribute towards the destruction of the vegetation as well, and the economy by extension. So for our viewers, now it's not just about the volcanic eruption only, but the impact it's had on the livelihood and the welfare of our people in St. Vincent also.
Yes, certainly. In fact, I mean, if you there's never a good time for a volcano to erupt, explosively, certainly. But if there was, if one of the worst times for it to erupt would be in the middle of a global pandemic, and that is what St. Vincent has to deal with. It's not an easy time for their systems will be being tested and tried, and I suspect they have another couple of weeks and hopefully weeks rather than months of dealing with both an exploding mountain as well as the COVID pandemic that is ongoing. It's unfortunate. That's what they have to deal with.
It's so unfortunate, and again, our hearts go out to the community of St. Vincent, really and truly, and know that you're not alone. Even though we're in separate islands, know that you're not alone. We're all one.
Yep.
I'm noticing my camera flips on me. I'm upside down.
I noticed that too. Yes.
I didn't do anything. It just flipped on its own. Okay. No, don't take it off. One minute. No, just flip it on the side. Before you can turn, just turn it back. Let me help you. Huh? No, man. 1 minute, please. Oh, my Lord. I don't know if it's this. Okay, take it off. Take it off. I'm going to put it on. It's working. I saw it, but I didn't know it was. No, you gotta turn back the other way. Turn back the other way. Huh? Okay. Okay, I think it's good. Oh, I guess that's why our viewers were laughing. Okay.
I should have sent and told you.
I saw it, but I'm figuring it's just on my end. I didn't realize it was actually. Okay, so, sorry, Martin Nisbet. So we are making you dizzy. Forgive us. My camera flipped, so forgive us. So forgive us for that. Okay. Let me go back. Okay, so again, to our viewers, I apologize. I did not realize my camera flipped. So forgive me. I didn't even touch it and it just flipped on its own. So sorry about that. Another question is it possible for the volcanic discharge to reach the green zone?
It depends on what you mean by the discharge. The way in which the hazard map is defined in St. Vincent, you have various zones. The red zone is the area that is going to be impacted by all the, for want of a better word, nasty things that could happen with the volcano. So the blocks and bombs, the thick ash fall, the density currents, the lahars or mud flows, everything that you could think that could be bad about the volcano and what it could do would affect the red area. And then the next in line in terms of impact area is the orange area. So on the fringes of the red, you know, the less thick ash fall, the coarser fragments of rock, not so much fine ash, but coarser ash, perhaps some fringe of the density currents, some mud flows. Those are the areas. And then when you get to the yellow areas and the green areas, the impact is going to be mainly ashfall. So in the context of the question, it means that ashfall can get throughout the entire country. Most of the ash that comes from the volcano is going to go offshore. They're going to go to the east and the west coast because of the wind patterns in the region. And some of it will creep to the south. It will creep to the south and move to the south, depending largely on whether the wind is blowing to the south and also how big the plume of ash is. If it goes high in the atmosphere, it spreads out in all directions. So in the context of the question, the effusion from the volcano, some of it can get to the south. In this context, the effusion I'm speaking about is the ash fall. Fine ash can get to the south. It's unlikely for a lot of it to get to the south. Most of it is still in north or go offshore. And in fact, one of the probably not so nice things, I guess if you're living in Barbados about this particular volcano, is that this volcano produces, in some cases, more ash fall in Barbados than it does in the southern part of St. Vincent, simply because of the wind direction. So Bajans in Barbados, they have to look out for ash fall once this volcano is erupting. More so than Vincentians in Kingstown, say, for example. So that's one thing to note. Ashfall can impact wider areas than the country from which the eruption is happening.
Mm. Do you have an idea more or less how far can the ash go? You mentioned Barbados.
Yeah, the ash.
I mean,
okay, for example, in 1902, fine ash went as far as Jamaica, as far as South America. Once it gets caught up in the atmosphere, the fine ash just spreads and keeps spreading until it can't be sustained anymore by the wind and it falls out. So it could easily get to Barbados and St. Lucia, the ash. It may get further afield depending on how big the plume is and how much it spreads. And further afield could mean that you could realistically have fine droppings of ash on ships or on islands, all the way somewhere to the extent from the northeast to the southwest, because of how the wind is. Therefore, that's how the pattern of ash tends to be developed.
One of our viewers, Sharon Gums, I call her Bajan girl. She said Barbados is already impacted.
Yes, it is indeed. Yes, I think they had ash fall from the second episodes of explosive eruptions today. That produced a very high plume. That then a lot of the direction of one of the dominant direction of the ash was towards the east, which is Barbados. I think they had ash for earlier on this afternoon today.
What happens to the lava when it cools down, and how long does that process take? Does it harden like rocks, or is it more like dust? And will it have to be cleaned up? How long can it burn for?
Right. I think the person is asking a couple of things. The magma, when it comes out slowly or fast, depending on how much gas it has in it. When it comes out, as soon as it starts coming out, it starts becoming solid. So it comes out as a molten material. You could think of it as liquid rock. But once it reaches the surface and interacts with the atmosphere, it becomes cool and it becomes solid rock. So in the context of our volcano, Soufriere here in St. Vincent, the period between December 27th up until the explosion started about yesterday morning, you had a mass of rock essentially building up. And when I say a mass of rock, you're talking about pieces of rock that were as small as my two fists together, but as big as a meter in some cases, that were basically piling up in the crater. They were coming out as semi-liquid, and once they reach outside, they become solid, and they add as a rubble pile. Now, that's what had happened. So that material that's come out, it forms a cool skin very rapidly, but in the interior, it can remain hot for a long time. So I was telling you that there were temperatures of the interior parts were up to 600 degrees Celsius, but on the outer skin in some parts, it was just warm. So, for example, we were able to sample some of that ash. In terms of how long it remains warm, it depends really on where it is, on how big the mass is. So beneath the surface, where it's insulated from the atmosphere, it could remain warm for many years. While at the surface, it wouldn't stay warm for more than a few days. So it could cool down very fast. The other thing that the person sounded like they were asking about was really ash. Now, in addition, when the magma comes out and it forms a dome or it forms a lava flow, it's a solid mass of rock. But when you have explosions, the explosions break that rock apart, fragments it, as we would say as geologists, fragments it into smaller pieces, and those smaller pieces get pushed up into the atmosphere as an ash cloud, and sometimes they collapse on themselves and they produce these density currents that move down the mountainside. Now that ash plume, the ash that's in the plume, that's in the cloud, will get cool very fast because it's very fine particles, so mixed with the atmosphere, it gets cool. But sometimes when it falls back, if you're close to the volcano, it would actually be still warm. While the pyroclastic flows or the density currents that move on the mountainside very fast, these things that move very fast and that are quite dangerous, and they can remain hot for days after. So if a pyroclastic flow came down a mountainside and the deposit is there, when we as geologists, for example, we will then go in the field and look at it. When we go and look at it in the field, we have to be careful how we step in, because sometimes if we put our foot down in it, it's still hot enough to burn you. Even though it's fine particles of material, it's still hot. So at the very least, the material could stay hot if it's at the surface for a couple of days. If it's solid, it might be longer than that. But when it's beneath the surface, it can stay long in terms of warmth and cool it down for years.
To the viewer who asked that question, I really hope you're satisfied with the response from the professor. How close can life forms? Oh, I read it already.
I think we got that one already.
Yes. The effects of the environment. I think two persons asked it.
Yeah.
So someone said, this is probably not your field, but are you aware of what will happen to the people that are evacuated from the red zones? Will the government be helping them financially, or are they dependent on the country that takes them in? Again, this may not be your field.
Yeah, but I know generally what the evacuation plans are in a general sense, because we work closely with the National Emergency Management Organization. And I believe what the plan is for the people who have been evacuated is that while they are in shelters, they have accommodated them in a number of shelters, whether on St. Vincent, or I believe they actually had some arrangement with cruise ships, which would have them in the harbor in St. Vincent. But while they are on the shelters or wherever they have taken them to, the government will pick up the cost of their food on board, more or less, so that they would taking care of them as long as they're there. I don't think there is any plan for off-island, so moving them off the island in any way. That's not currently a major part of the plan, but if they do that, well, then I suspect that there are arrangements in place for taking care of them, at least for some period of time. But once they've been evacuated from where they are normally, it's usually understood that there's some sort of support, certainly, for the people wherever they're taken to, and that's in place currently.
Okay, I think there is very, very good cooperation between countries.
Yeah.
What effect will have? Okay, I asked. We spoke about this one interconnectedly before. What effect will this have on people considering there is a pandemic? We already spoke about that. The impact it will have on the economy.
Yeah, I believe that. Well, it's two things. The current situation in terms of the pandemic makes it very dangerous to put people in shelters. So that I think one of the things that the government is trying to do is, and I think in some cases they insist in that people who have to go in shelters, or depending on where the shelter is, for example, if some of the people who evacuated wanted to go onto the cruise ships that have provided the services to the government of St. Vincent Grenadines to stock people, I think they're actually required to take the COVID vaccine. And in fact, in some cases, I think in some of the shelters, they're also requiring them to do that, to minimize the impact of a potential outbreak of COVID. Because the shelters, by their very nature, require you to have people in a confined space, which is against the whole protocol for COVID. So I think that's one of the ways in which they're dealing with it. But if the person was asking the question in the context of how the country would cope with the challenges of dealing with COVID and dealing with the fallout of the eruption, I mean, I've heard the Prime Minister speak about the fact that different nations have to show their resilience and they have to work together to rebuild and to withstand the twin sort of hazards that are now posed both with COVID, the pandemic, and with the volcano. And I know as a Vincent myself that we tend to be very strong. We're accustomed to weathering many storms. I suspect that they would have to do that. They have no choice, and they can. And I'm sure that they would have support from their fellow Caribbean people, like people in your country, as well as further afield.
So the other question is, do you know anything about the process of getting these people vaccinated in order to be allowed into the place of refuge? What is the procedure? What will happen to the people that refuse to be vaccinated? Again, we do not know if you're able to answer that question.
Yeah, that one I'm not sure about. I just know that they're encouraging people, or in some cases insisting that if you want to, I believe that for certain shelters, they're required to. So for example, I believe certainly for the cruise ships, I think the arrangement that the cruise ships insisted in terms of providing assistance to the government that if they are going to allow them to have their cruise ships, that they have to ensure that the people are vaccinated. So I think in that case, if you refuse, I guess, to go to be vaccinated, then it means that you can't go on a cruise ship. You have to go to a different shelter. My understanding is that there are shelters for everybody, whether or not they whether or not they choose to be vaccinated, because they've evacuated people, so they're required to take care of them to a certain extent.
Another question: the tremors the island is now experiencing, are they proof of displacement of a matter in the Earth's crust? So that apparently there are tremors throughout the region from time to time.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's two different kinds of tremors in a sense. I think if I take tremors in this context to mean the shaking of the ground, right? The shaking of the ground, or earthquakes, or the earthquaking or the earth shaking. In the region, in the Caribbean region, we have sort of two main categories of earthquake types. You have those that are caused by the fact that the Earth's crust in the Caribbean and the rest of the world is not continuous, and it moves relative to each other in a theory called plate tectonics, where one part moves relative to the other. That explains how parts of the Earth's crust move, and therefore, in trying to move or in moving, the movement is not completely free, and the different parts of the Earth's crust get stuck. And earthquakes are caused, one way in which you cause earthquake is by the plates or the parts of the Earth crust that move as one. So one plate moves as a single entity, while another plate moves on another entity. And how they interact, whether they slide past each other, they move above each other, or move to each other. Because that interaction is not smooth, they develop stresses that are then released as earthquakes. And we call these tectonic earthquakes. Now, the other main kind of earthquake that we have is the ones like what are associated with the volcanoes and the volcano that is currently erupting. When magma, this molten rock or this liquid rock, when it comes from beneath the surface and is trying to break through, it has the resistance of the material above it. And when it pushes it apart and breaks the rock, that again sends up vibrations, earthquakes, but these are now called volcanic earthquakes because they're related to magma movement. Volcanic earthquakes tend to be associated with volcanoes, and they tend to be one of the ways in which we know the volcano is doing something. It's a precursory signal to eruption. In fact, in this particular eruption, we use the nature of the volcanic earthquakes or the tremors coming from the volcano to tell us what was happening. And it's that largely that allowed us to tell the government before the eruption started that this looked like it was going in a particular direction. These tremors, these earthquakes, volcanic in nature.
Thank you very much for that explanation.
Yep.
So one of St. Martin's member of parliament, I'm seeing here Mr. Claudius Boncamper, he said that the eruption released enough pressure from the volcano, or are more eruptions still possible in the near future?
Right. The simple answer is yes. What we think has happened and what led to this eruption and what is driving this eruption is that some of this molten rock, this magma, which magma is always there beneath the surface in these contexts, in these regions. One of the driving forces for the creation of the landmass, the islands that we love and we live on, is this magma moving. The magma moves through the earth and it finds a space and it finds a space and it gets to the surface through some vent. It creates submarine volcanoes, then subaerial volcanoes, and the volcanoes get bigger and bigger. They form islands. We live on the islands. That's how we are formed. So this magma came from below and wanted to add to what was Soufriere Mountain, and it slowly made its way to the top. At this present time, it's at the top. And because it's gas rich, because it has a lot of energy, it's going to take a little while for it to use up that energy, for all that batch to come out. And we think that we know at the starting of its coming out. So yes, we could have more of the same, where we have ongoing explosive episodes where it jets ash and steam. We could have these going on for a little bit longer before it gets rid of all that batch that has just come through. So, given past experience, it could go on for a few weeks, it could go on for a little bit longer than that, and one day is unlikely to be the end of it. So we've only had one day. So we're still kind of early days yet before it looks like it's going to end.
MP Camper, I hope Professor was able to answer your question. Do you have any reason to suspect that any part of the island might sink because of the eruption or displacement of matter because of earthquakes?
Yeah, that's actually interestingly, that's a very common question when these activity get going, that people think of sinking, and I can guess where it comes from. It comes from the fact that in some instances where you have large tectonic earthquakes, there's usually displacement or movement of one part of the earth relative to another, such that one part goes down and the other part comes up. It's normally is a process called faulting. So when people think of earthquakes, they think of one part sinking. And when they think of a mountain erupting like this one, and where you have earthquakes, they think that the same process can go on. Now, to a certain extent, a limited version of it could go on, in the sense that if the mountain shakes enough, little bits of it could fall off. Remember, I was speaking about earlier on when I said about collapse,
Yes.
collapse of the edifice.
Yes.
That is what could happen. A large part of it could simply fall off and fall into the sea. That's possible. Or a smaller part could fall off and fall into the sea. And that's possible. That's what's going to happen on the volcano itself. In terms of the entire island sinking, that is unlikely, because remember, the island was built up from successive eruptions. The islands are not just at the surface, they're rooted to the earth underground. It's not easy for them to sink. So a single eruption, which is part of a process that built the entire island. This island has been building from the south all the way to the north with progressive eruptions of progressive volcanoes. An eruption of this Soufriere volcano is extremely unlikely to cause the island as a whole to sink in any way. But bits and pieces could fall off because of all the shaking. And the bits and pieces that fall off are likely to be on Soufriere itself. So you can have little landslides from coastal areas.
Okay. I'm happy you mentioned that it's on at Soufriere itself, because I'm wondering, when you said bits and pieces can fall off, what about persons who are residing in a specific area? But it's clear that you mentioned.
On the volcano
what exactly
itself.
Bits and pieces, though? How big could bits and pieces be?
Right. So if you think of a landslide, you go along the coast, like you go along a road anyway, over a steep road, and when you have heavy rain, or if you have a big earthquake, you could have a little landslide. That kind of thing can happen, because when the volcano is erupting, there's a lot of shaking of the ground, and that shaking of the ground could cause small landslides. And when I say bits and pieces, that's what I mean. Landslides can occur along the coast, in the river valleys, and that's how bits and pieces could fall off. Not like a whole mass of the thing could collapse. I mean, that you could have large-scale collapse of the edifice itself, but not from shaking alone. It has to involve other processes besides it just shaking. And that we're not seeing any sign of that currently at Soufriere. Something that we look for about the possibility of edifice collapse, and so far we're not seeing any evidence for that.
Okay, I think that's very good, and I think it's also very good. It brings a peace of mind and a level of comfort towards citizens in St. Vincent, as well as persons throughout the region, to know that this is being monitored closely as well. What are the implications for people that do not evacuate from the red zone? Might these people suffer from suffocation or poisoning?
My simple answer to that is that they could be killed, dead. The implication is that they could be killed. Simply, when volcanoes erupt, the most dangerous things, as I was mentioning to you, is these things that we call density current, pyroclastic flows, or rapidly moving masses of rock, fragments of large boulders, gas. They are hot. The larger boulders hug the ground. If you could visualize in your head, instead of a plume of ash, when you look at a volcano erupting, I mean, you can look at the movies and you see it felts a lot of stuff up in the air. If you think in your head that instead of all that stuff going up in the air rapidly, it comes down a mountainside rapidly. That is what pyroclastic density currents are, these rapidly moving masses of ash. And on the volcano, in the red zone consists of the area where those kinds of things can happen. But not only those kinds of things. So if that alone wasn't enough, and that's bad as it is, you can have very thick ash fall, and the ash is not going to be fine ash, it's going to be coarse grit. And if that wasn't bad enough, you could have large boulders that would be pelted out in an explosion and fall back on the ground, what we call ballistics. And if that wasn't bad enough, when the ash falls, it falls on the ground, and then when rain falls, the rain washes the ash into the rivers, and they become lahars or mud flows. And if that wasn't bad enough, that's where you will have all the earthquakes happening. So you can have earthquakes that could be so bad that could shake you. And if that wasn't bad enough, you have lightning strikes in the column. When the column of ash goes up in the air, there are lightning strikes in the column and between the column and the ground. So in the red zone, that's why I said all the nasty things that can happen are in the red zone. So if you stay in the red zone, that is what you potentially expose yourself to. Now, you may survive, you may be lucky, but I wouldn't personally put my chances on you surviving if the mountain really does what it can do. So that's why we suggest people need to move out of the red zone.
I think it was essential that we see this question, because we all know there are some persons who are very stubborn. Nothing is going to happen. God got me. I pray. But we still do need to use our level of common sense as well, and to be able to secure our safety. So I'm very happy you were able to detailedly explain what can happen should someone refuse to move out of that red zone.
There's an aspect of that, just to add to that, that I personally, I guess, I have a problem with, is that not only do the people put themselves at risk, but we all human beings, we live in communities. And the fact is, if somebody actually stays there and they do become in harm's way, so for example, if they got hurt, invariably, we who are in the safe part and have gone south would then be obliged to go and rescue them.
Exactly.
Therefore, they're not putting only themselves at risk, they're now putting other people at risk who now have to come to rescue them. So that is where I have a big problem with people like that, which, quite apart from them putting themselves at risk, that's okay. If you want to do that and take the chance, that's fine with you. I'm good with that. But then I would have to arrange to come and rescue you when something happens, and I have a problem with that. So,
it's definitely a chain reaction, because whether or not they if they do not adhere to the warnings and relocate, and as you stated, should something happen, it's deemed for them to have rescues. And if someone goes there and a team of rescuers go to rescue, they themselves is at risk of losing their lives or being injured. And again, if persons refuse to go, then you'll be blamed that person didn't help and no one went to help them. So for persons who are viewing, we encourage you to follow the protocols. If you're in the red zone, to try your best to relocate. Not even try your best to relocate, and protect yourself, protect your family, protect the people of your country as well, the rescuers. Where am I? Given the current state of the Soufriere volcano, how is this impacting global warming? You mentioned this already. Can the Soufriere volcano activities cause a trigger reaction in Kikem-Jenny, the active submarine volcano located under the Caribbean seafloor?
Okay, so the simple answer to that is no. And again, that is one of those I mentioned before. I had a question. You had asked a question that was quite common. This is another common one, that people in the region tend to think that the volcanoes are connected in some direct way. That if something happens at one, someone could cause the effect on another one. The volcanoes don't operate like that. They all are caused fundamentally by the same process. So we have volcanoes in the region because of a process called subduction zone volcanism. Subduction zones occur where one part of the crust dips on another and creates conditions for volcanism. And that's why we have volcanoes here. But the volcanoes have their own independent sources of magma and their own independent ways of operating, and they're not connected directly. So that if one does something, the other does something. And if it actually happens, it's a matter of coincidence rather than a causal relationship between one and the other.
I think that was very key for us to understand, because you are right. We do feel, because there is a connection between below the earth crust. We believe when one is activated, all will be activated, or possibly some will be activated. So that clarity brings a lot of better understanding. How can the current volcanic activities trigger other volcanoes like Mount Tsunami, which is located in Saba?
Right. So, I mean, that's related to the same question,
Yes.
that they're not connected. But to say that, I mean, it's a fact that you have volcanoes and volcanism in the other parts of the region, and just like ours, it came alive and is doing things, others could do that. So the volcanoes in the region, and you have at least one live volcano, or one volcano that can erupt in at least in every one of the territories in the region. Volcanoes in the region need to be monitored and need to be kept under close watch by people monitoring them and being able to detect if they're showing any signs of unrest. And if they're not, well, that should change. I believe that all of them are under some sort of watch by some entity. And that's a good thing. We need to make sure people are aware of the hazards that they can pose to people, and we need to make sure that we prepare for the potential impact of these hazards.
Professor, this is a question for myself. I know you're based in the St. Augustine campus of the UWI, but are there any other international bodies that are supporting this research project, that are supporting your team?
Yeah, well, I'm physically based normally in St. Augustine, but currently with an ongoing eruption, we have a team based here in St. Vincent. I'm physically at Belmont Observatory at present. And the team that is helping to provide support here is drawn not just from the Seismic Research Center in Trinidad, but we have colleagues at the Montserrat Volcano Observatory, where we have staff that are part of our organization who are based. They are also part of the support team. As well, we have a larger group of colleagues from the UK mainly, but also from the US who have provided support. So while I'm based here, our interaction is much wider. The second thing is that there's a lot of research that goes on volcanoes. From universities like we are attached to, but in the context of this eruption and this volcano here, our task is really more a matter of monitoring and providing real-time advice to governments to take action to minimize the impact. So it's less of a research operations than a monitoring operation, monitoring, early warning, advice, and that kind of thing, which is what we do. The research comes after, and research is related to how much it could add to the advice and the guidance we provide, rather than research in an absolute way. Because once the volcano is doing what it's doing, the research have to be relevant directly to providing life-saving advice to governments that have to deal with these hazards.
Mm-hmm. I'm very happy the Caribbean region teams came together and was able to build a very strong support network for this. So that's very good. My last question is, Professor Robertson, several years ago, you were a part of the Soufriere team, the Soufriere research project. Has the data from said research been useful for this current event? If so, how?
Yeah, the Soufriere research project, which was a UK-led project that involved, it was a STREVA, S-T-R-E-V-A, stands for Strengthening Resilience on Volcanic Areas. Sort of it was attempting, and St. Vincent was one of the focus, to look at how we understand volcanism, how we understand risk, and in fact, in the context of St. Vincent, it helped to develop products, actually practical and real products, that were useful in both educating the public about the volcanic hazards. So, for example, in St. Vincent, we developed an exhibition, a robot exhibition that helped in educating the public long before this eruption. We've been doing public education and highlighting the hazards of the volcano long before the eruption started. As well as it allowed us to gather information about the people who are at risk, and helped us to therefore prepare our approach to the management of the operation in a certain way. In addition, we did some research related to the mechanics of Soufriere, the science of the Soufriere volcano itself, that would have helped in terms of our understanding of what is going on. So the project STREVA was extremely helpful, and projects like that, research projects which are to a large extent driven by UK research funds, has helped tremendously in terms of our understanding of certain kinds of processes, and in fact, our management of the current eruption that is ongoing. So it was great. It was great to work with the collaborators that we did with Soufriere, and it certainly did make a difference in terms of how we have operated and how we have managed the current and ongoing eruption in Soufriere.
Oh, thank you. Just out of curiosity, for persons in countries like St. Martin who have an interest in understanding disaster risk management, volcanic activities, risk reduction, how can they, is there anybody, any organization they can join, even if it's a summer program or so, that they can just be a part of to learn more and to be able to give back, to engage in with what's happening in our region?
Well, there are a couple of regional organizations I would suggest that, and local, I would suggest that they probably contact and get involved in their own disaster management agency. Most of the agencies would exist, and I'm sure they're always looking for volunteers because they're always on the staff and on the resource often, and see how they could assist there and they could get practical experience. But also there are various universities that do programs if they wanted to learn more, both at the University of West Indies as well as some of the community colleges in most of the islands, as well as there are regional entities like the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency that I believe have programs that allow them to become attached. And finally, there is a facility offered by the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance that provides a kind of summer internship. It funds a summer internship. It's competitive, but it funds a summer internship for people to be attached to various agencies. And one of them is SEDEMA, one of them is Seismic, and various other agencies where they could get practical experience about various aspects of disaster management. So there's a number of options in the region. I think they need to start at their own at home first and then go regionally and look for options for funding and attachments at places like Seismic, at the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology, at SEDEMA, and various other places like that. And that could actually be funded by agencies like CRIP.
Thank you so much, Professor Robertson. Is there anything else you think will be essential for us to know? Any other information?
Well, yes. I mean, as we touched on the ongoing eruption of the Soufriere in St. Vincent, in the context of what it can do in St. Vincent. I'm just hoping that people understand that the impact of the eruption in St. Vincent is not necessarily going to be confined to St. Vincent. I mean, the most adverse effect is on the island, but the impact of ash goes wider afield, both directly in terms of ash fallout in other islands, but indirectly in that once you pump in a lot of ash into the atmosphere, it affects aviation traffic. So the flight of planes are affected negatively, so that it might be longer to get from A to B throughout the region because the planes are trying to avoid the ash cloud that is in the atmosphere from Soufriere. So whether you like it or not, we live in a region that are impacted by hazards, and we are interconnected. So even in terms of the way in which the hazard impacts us, we're interconnected. We're interconnected in terms of the fact that if the hazard affects your neighbor, it could affect you indirectly as well as directly. So I think it's useful for people to bear that in mind. So Soufriere, St. Vincent is not only in a sense Soufriere's problem and St. Vincent's problem, but in that sense, as we say, it's all our problem. So we need to bear that in mind and see how we could fit in terms of making a contribution to make it less impactful on ourselves and in the rest of the region.
But how can persons like myself in St. Martin, throughout other Caribbean islands, how can we contribute to something?
Right. Well, I think you could reach out to the National Emergency Management Organization. You could reach out to the St. Vincent embassies, St. Vincent organizations, and find out what kind of support they might need, what kind of help they might need. And I'm sure they have a long list of things that they might find that could be useful. I suggest they will reach out to those agencies and find out, is there anything they need? Is there anything that can do? Because if this continues for a little while, St. Vincent certainly would and could do with support from external agencies or partners in the region, like yourself.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so I just have one more question. How can you explain how important the energy, the horror system is for the tsunami? Or the emergency horn? emergency horn. His writing is not the best.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the emergency horn system.
Okay.
I believe they're referring to the fact that in some areas, it happens in volcanic areas too. For example, in the Soufriere's Montserrat, in Montserrat, where they have the Soufriere's eruption ongoing, there's a system of emergency horns that tells you if it's necessary to evacuate or not, and it applies with tsunamis too. So in areas where you have hazards that are likely to have rapid onset and require rapid action from the public without necessarily having time to provide some sort of other notification, things like emergency horns that essentially sends a message out en masse to a large group are things that could work quite nicely.
Thank you so much, Professor, for making the time. It's been a long time coming, but we do appreciate your taking the time, your staff, Talia, extend our gratitude to Talia as well. And our viewers, they're all excited. Gemma Critton said, yes, Barbados always gets plenty ash. So you are right there. Barbados is and will remain to be continue to be affected. So thank you again for being here. If you do not mind, let's just say goodbye, and then I will come behind and say a few thank yous before. Oh, Candy is here. Thank you guys for covering the Soufriere. It's effective. Candy is from St. Vincent. So this is one person who's from St. Vincent who lives in the US. So there are so many persons like her. So Candy, thank you so much for tuning in. And Christopher in St. Vincent, thank you so much as well. So to our viewers, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. It was a very special occasion, very special, very necessary conversation that needed to be had. We just want to thank you so much. We have viewers from all around the world. We know our time zones are very different, but we do appreciate you tuning in irrespective of that. So again, thank you for supporting 721 News. Thank you for supporting me, my very first time on 721. So, and Kumiko is in the back. So thank you all so very much. Have a good night.